Can newbie programmers make games? Coming up. Hey everybody, I'm Travis Vroman. For those of you who are new here, I upload daily videos with tips, tricks, and industry advice for game developers. So if this is something that interests you, consider subscribing. So today I want to answer the question as to whether or not a newbie programmer can make games. So the short answer to this is absolutely, and there's no reason not to. Just because you're new at programming does not mean that you can't make games. There are game engines out there, in fact, that require no programming to use whatsoever. One of the common examples that I bring up of an engine that doesn't really require programming is Construct. It's got a really nice, clean, neat interface. It's very easy to use. It's got a lot of tutorials. It's got a lot of content on how to do things. So the Construct engine was designed for designers. It wasn't designed for somebody who has to know how to code in order to be able to use. In fact, you don't need to know any coding whatsoever in order to be able to use Construct, and that's one of its strengths. In order to make a game, it's literally dragging and dropping pieces and filling out text boxes and entering numbers and setting up events, and it's all things that are done through a graphical interface that are very easy and intuitive to use. They also have a lot of content as far as tutorials and forum posts, and they've got a super helpful community. There are tons of games that have been made out there with Construct that required no programming at all from the game developer who made them. Even if you have zero knowledge on programming, you can make games. Another example of this is the Unreal Engine. Now, Unreal has this system called the Blueprint system, which is a sort of graphical programming. It's a node editor, basically, where you can take pieces of logic that are represented in a graphical manner, like a Boolean, true or false, and you can drag a line from one node to another node in order to turn things on and off, or you can insert colors and you can make shaders that way, and you can make all kinds of crazy effects, movement, and all kinds of things. It's done completely in a graphical manner and you don't have to touch code at all. That being said, Unreal also allows you, if you wanted to write your own code in C++. So if that's something that interests you, that might be in a direction that you look. Unity also allows JavaScript or C#. There's another engine out there called Godot, which has its own visual scripting language as well, which you could also edit behind the scenes in code. And that's very easy to understand and use. There are lots of game engines out there which require no programming to stand up and use right out of the box. There are other engines out there that require a little bit more programming experience in order to be able to use, but you don't necessarily have to start with those. So the bottom line here is if you choose an engine that is more design-centric, even as a new programmer, you can make games. The other thing to remember is that you don't necessarily have to use a game engine to make games. You could also make something like an old school style text-based roguelike or something along those lines. All that requires is knowledge of how to write text out to a command prompt. So there are a lot of options out there for new programmers to be able to make games. You can use one of the existing engines that are out there. You can make your own console games with C++ or C# if you wanted to, or some other language. You know, there's tons of languages that write out to the command prompt. I've even seen games that were made entirely in HTML, just using simple CSS and DOM and JavaScript. For your first couple games, especially while you're learning, there's nothing wrong with that. So another topic that I sort of want to touch on briefly is just because you're new at programming and maybe your code isn't super clean and maybe you haven't learned all of what you need to learn in order to be able to make a game, doesn't mean that you can't actually make a game. A lot of the games that are out there in production, the code base is an absolute nightmare and a mess. It's written by people very hastily and put together and sort of pushed out the door because it works. There's not anything necessarily wrong with that from a standpoint of it could be a successful game. It doesn't have to be a neat, clean, super organized code base under the hood in order to be successful. Now, granted, there are best practices out there for programming, and those best practices exist for a reason, but you don't have to be a super qualified programmer to make games. Game programming is one of the hardest things out there, and if you try to write your own engine, then that gets super complicated very quickly, especially if you're doing something like initializing OpenGL on your own from scratch. That gets complicated very quick, but you don't have to do that to start making games. You don't have to start there. You can work up to that. So that's really all I've got on this topic. I'd like to hear back from you guys on what are some of the projects that you made when you were learning to start programming, or maybe that you're currently working on. Maybe you're new at this and you're currently trying to build a game. And I'd like to hear in the comments below some of the things that you guys are working on and trying to learn programming and how you're building a game and how you're approaching it. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, consider subscribing, and I will see you guys tomorrow.